Let's finish up the last part of chapter 2 of Santa Ana, the people, the Pueblo, and the history of Tamaya. I did overestimate, I didn't calculate correctly how many pages I had left. So that is where we are. Okay. The refugees from Tigrex pueblos gathered at Mojo, a pueblo on the west side of the Rio Grande, north of Alcanfor, and at another unnamed pueblo, half a league farther north. When they refused to submit to the Spaniards, Coronado himself led the attack against Mojo. At Mojo, however, the Spaniards did not enjoy an easy victory. Unable to capture the pueblo, they were forced to besiege it throughout the bitter winter. The defenders held out until March, when their water supplies ran out. Then they tried to slip away. Some succeeded in escaping across the Rio Grande, though it was swollen by the spring runoff, but many others were killed in the attempt or captured and held as servants. After the defeat of Mojo in March, most of the fighting came to an end in the Tigrex region. The survivors fled to more remote sites, and these pueblos along the Rio Grande were never resettled as long as the army remained in that region, no matter what assessors were given them, what assurances were given them. During the long winter, as resentment in Tigrex province turned to open hostility, the Spaniards were forced to look elsewhere for their food and clothing they needed. Zia, a larger pueblo to the northwest, bartered a certain number of blankets, skins, and quilts in exchange for Spanish trade goods. After the siege of Mojo, Coronado sent a captain to Chia, a fine pueblo with a large population. He found the pueblo quiet and left in its care 4 bronze cannons which were in bad condition. A Spanish expedition also visited Tigrex province, where they found 7 pueblos. The pueblos to the north were wary of the Spaniards. Zia had sent messages offering submission, and at the first of the Tigrex pueblos, which must have contained 100 residents, the people ran away, not daring to wait for the Spaniards, who ran to intercept them and brought them back, fully protected, to their pueblos and homes. From this pueblo, the Spaniards sent word to the other pueblos in order to restore their confidence, and Castañeda claimed the whole region was gradually reassured. When spring came at last to the region and the Rio Grande, which had been frozen solid, began to thaw, the Spaniards were eager to move on to the rich land of Quivira. The pueblos, no doubt, were also eager to see the treacherous men depart. On May 5th, the Spanish army left Tigrex, marching north and east towards Pecos. Within a month, however, Coronado had decided that the entire army could not make the journey to Quivira. He chose a small party to continue eastward and sent the main army, led by Arellano, back to Tigrex to prepare for a second winter. In mid-July, the larger group reached Rio Grande. They found the Tigrex province still deserted, as it would remain so as long as the Spaniards stayed in the region. Once again, the army needed supplies for the coming winter, but this year no delegations from neighboring pueblos welcomed them with gifts of food and turquoise. In the region where they camped, the Spaniards found only the burned ruins of the pueblos that they had destroyed and the gutted, empty rooms of those whose inhabitants had fled destruction. In search of supplies, Arellano sent expeditions to Jemez, Taos, and other northern pueblos south beyond Tutajajo and east to Pecos. In mid-September, the time of harvest, along the Rio Grande, Coronado led a dejected band of Spaniards back to Tigrex. Once again, the dreams of riches had turned out to be nothing but fantasies. Quivira was not a golden kingdom, but a town of grass houses that had only a little maize. No gold, no silver, and no precious stones. Worse yet, Coronado discovered that the people of Pecos had told their guide to take the Spaniards out there and lead them astray on the plains, where they would become so feeble that upon their return the people of Sicuye could kill them easily and so obtain revenge for what the Spaniards had done to them. It was apparent to the Spaniards that they were no longer welcome guests in Pueblo lands, and they had begun to learn that the people of the region, although peaceable by choice, were far from helpless. As soon as Coronado returned to the Rio Grande, he tried to pacify some neighboring pueblos that were restless, and to invite the people of Tigrex to make peace. He tried also to obtain some native clothing, because the soldiers were already naked and in a wretched condition. The winter of 1541-42, like the one that had gone before it, was intensely cold, with snow and heavy frosts along the Rio Grande. Few of the Spaniards still believed that the Golden City might be found farther inland. Coronado, injured in a fall from a horse, lost interest in the expedition, and the Spaniards learned that the Indians to the south were in open revolt. As soon as the snows melted in April 1542, the expedition prepared to return to their homes in the south. Only one part of the dream survived the winter. Two friars, still hoping to convert the people of Sicuye, Pecos, and Quivira, chose to stay when the Spaniards left the Rio Grande. For their protection, Coronado ordered the soldiers who had natives in their service to let them go freely to their pueblos or wherever they wished. As soon as these orders were carried out, the army left the way it had come, retracing its steps to Zuni and south to New Spain. Spring had also been a time of joy along the Rio Grande, and this year the people had an additional reason to rejoice. As the seedlings emerged with the promise of summer's harvest, the men who had brought violence, famine, and treachery to the region departed. This time, the word would travel back to the Rio Grande that Questura had truly gone. During those 2 long winters, the people of Tamaya must have encountered the people of Questura, but no record speaks of where, when, and how those meetings occurred. In all of the many reports of the Coronado expedition, and all of the volumes that recorded the hearings held in Spain and New Spain to review its conduct, there is not a single reference to the Tamaya as a distinct people. The Spaniards who went to the Rio Grande believed that all of the pueblos had, in general, the same ceremonies and customs. The members of the expedition had neither the curiosity nor the ability to learn a great deal about these peoples. The strangers spoke none of the languages of those who lived in the region, so they learned only what little they could be communicated through signs, and less often through interpreters from neighboring tribes. To Questura, the pueblos were of little interest except for potential sources of treasure, converts, and food and clothing, or as potential threats to Spanish camps and herds. Thus the records of the Spanish expedition contains many gaps. gaps in which the histories of Tamaya and other pueblos lie hidden. To a large extent, the nature of Tamaya's first meeting with Castro would have depended upon where the Tamaya were during the autumn of 1540, when the Spaniards came to the Rio Grande. If the people of Tamaya were still farming in the villages along the Rio Grande, between the areas that later came to be known as Albuquerque and Bernalillo, the history of their encounter with Castro may be intertwined with the story of the region the Spaniards called the Tigres province. If the Tamaya were dwelling in this region during the winter of 1540 to 41, they, like their Tiwa neighbors, must have suffered greatly. They could have been among those killed or captured by the Spaniards. Their storerooms could have been emptied to supply the soldiers with food and clothing, and they might have been forced to flee in the middle of winter to find refuge in more isolated places. If, on the other hand, the Tamaya had left the Rio Grande region by September or October of 1540, either to settle permanently elsewhere or to gather at a central pueblo for the winter, Castro's presence would have been less likely to cause great disruption in their lives. If, as archaeology seems to suggest, the people of Tamaya were still farming the fields and living in the villages along the Rio Grande at this time, they might still have gathered after the harvest to spend the winter at a central pueblo more remote from the area where Coronado's men camped. Or perhaps by 1540, the Tamaya had abandoned the Rio Grande villages that they had built when they left Pacu a century earlier. They could, by that time, already have made the journey to Quisist ha Tamaya that is told of in the oral tradition. They may have moved north across the Rio Jemez to found Tamaya itself, or to settle in a village on the other side of the Rio Jemez, at the southern end of the mesa. They may have lived in a village on top of the Black Mesa, or in some other place away from Rio Grande. In any of those areas, distance would have sheltered the people from the full impact of the Spanish presence. Unlike their Tiwa neighbors, they would not have encountered Castro in battle, and probably few, if any, of the people would have been killed or captured. Wherever the people of Tamaya were living in 1540, however, they would almost certainly have been visited by Spaniards seeking food and clothing, and they would have heard of the things that the Spaniards had done elsewhere. It is possible that the first of the Quieres pueblos described by Cardenas was the home of the Tamaya, and that they were the people who fled when the Spaniards approached. In exchange for their food and clothing, the people of Tamaya may have received a few of Coronado's jingling bells, trinkets, and trade goods. They may have watched as a friar exhorted them, with signs and strange words, to accept the God of the Spaniards. Perhaps, too, they saw or even acquired some of the horses and livestock from the Spanish herds. If so, the Spanish explorers did not record it, nor do the documents reveal what was said when the Tiamune and the elders met, as they must have, to decide what the Tamaya should do. Castro's letters and reports preserved no accounts of the messages that must have passed among the Tamaya and the rest of the Hanun. Not a single document describes the worries that must have been in the minds of the women grinding corn, the children playing in the village, or the hunters who went to the mountains and the mesas in search of game. No member of Coronado's expedition recorded that. When spring arrived in 1542, the Tamaya went, as their fathers and grandfathers had, to tend the fields, and no Spaniard wrote that. As the people of Tamaya waited anxiously for the clouds that would bring rain to their seedlings that summer, they must also, after those 2 long winters, have watched with apprehension for the clouds of dust raised by horses and marching men, clouds that would bring not life-giving water, but disaster. The next chapter, Chapter 3, Castora returns. Thank you for joining me.